In this video, I'd like to introduce you to a poem by the American poet Emily Dickinson. And this poem is The Shipwreck. At least that is the title often given to it, although in the original, it doesn't really have a title. And this is fairly typical of Emily Dickinson poems. If you look, for instance, at the first publication of this poem in 1890 in a newspaper article on Emily Dickinson's poems, it's the first poem presented, and a lot of stuff is regularized. So it's given a title that it shouldn't really have. A lot of the lines are simplified, and often what you'll see is that instead of the ambiguity in the original, which is created by all these dashes, the editor has kind of just made the lines a little easier to understand and flow a little bit smoother as well. But the point of Emily Dickinson's poetry is in many ways to be challenging. We have this unusual syntax, we have these weird dashes for punctuation, there are many ways to read it as a result, and that tension is something we should embrace rather than kind of elide and ignore. So if you are a high school teacher, for example, and you're teaching this poem, I know it's very popular in high schools, the challenge is to bring out the difficulty rather than simply to cover over things and make things really straightforward. Okay, so the poem then was written much earlier than its first publication, but like many of Emily Dickinson's poems, it was not published in her lifetime. And if we look at this poem, the first thing we have to know is what genre it fits into. And the genre that we're talking about here is the ballad form. Okay, so the ballad form, and Emily Dickinson wrote quite a few ballads. The pattern here is fairly straightforward. So in terms of the rhyme scheme, we have A, B, C, B, and the point is that the second and the fourth lines rhyme. So you can go through each stanza and you'll see that land rhymes with sand and so on and so forth. But as you can already see, there is a kind of irregularity to this poem, right? This stanza here, the third one, has 5 lines, and the pattern in a sense breaks down. So the first thing to notice here is that even though she writes a kind of ballad, she is playing with the genre and she's doing things that are quite irregular. The rhythm of each line is irregular as well. And as we go through this, you'll see that the first number of stanzas, the stress of the syllables is often on the first word, right? Glee, the great storm is over, for, have recovered the land, and so on. And then towards the end, we get this shift where the first syllable is not stressed, and a softness, and the children, and only the sea. So we'll come back to that pattern, but it's important to recognize that she's playing with the genre, that she's doing some very unusual things, and that beside rhyming the second and the fourth line, she's not too concerned about being exact with her rhythmic pattern. Okay, so we know then that there's this rhyme scheme for a ballad. What else does a ballad do? Well, a ballad typically tells a dramatic story. Okay, so a dramatic story of some kind. And in fact, ballads about shipwrecks were very common in the 19th century. So she's not alone in doing this, but she is kind of criticizing a lot of those other types of ballads. Ballads are also between a kind of literary and popular mode. So a popular mode would be like a folk song, a lullaby, something that people pass on orally, whereas a literary genre is a little bit more highbrow, you could say. But in the 19th century, we see this interesting mixing of the two. So if we go back to the Romantics, let's say, and we look at Wordsworth and Coleridge, they published their lyrical ballads, right? Very famous collection of poetry. And what they wanted to do was to turn to the common people and bring that voice into literature. So this tension between the popular and the literary is an important feature of the ballad. Another thing to note here is that there's often a focus on the telling. So rather than just tell the story, some kind of dramatic story, the poet often draws attention to the telling itself. So focus on the telling of the story. And you can see that later in this poem where we have the retelling of the shipwreck story, and then we have an audience, and then we have this focus on the teller's eye, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of what a ballad is about. Now, before we analyze this poem in more detail, let's go back in time here and let's look at some other poems so we can see what Emily Dickinson is responding to. The first poem I want to have a look at is The Wreck of the Hesperus by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which was published in 1840. Now, the year before, in 1839, there was a huge storm off the coast of the eastern seaboard of the United States, and lots of ships were wrecked. Ironically, the Hesperus was damaged but not wrecked, but Longfellow kind of got his notes wrong. He had read some of the newspaper items about the storm, and he thought, I'm going to write this really dramatic ballad about this to commemorate things and to really impress people. So the very fact that he's not too concerned about historical details is important, because in a lot of these ballads, it's more about what we call sensationalism, about the shock factor, and impressing people emotionally. And we'll see Dickinson responding to this. So we're going to pick it up with this poem towards the end, and the basic plot here is that there's a skipper of the schooner Hesperus, the ship, and he's rather proud, and he ignores warnings, and he sails into a storm. And to protect his daughter, he ties his innocent daughter to a mast so that she's not going to get swept overboard. But in the end, both the skipper and the woman are frozen to death. So here is the ending of the poem. We read, "The breakers were right beneath her bows. She drifted a dreary wreck, and a whooping billow swept the crew like icicles from her deck. She struck where the white and fleecy waves looked soft as carded wool, but the cruel rocks, they gored her side like the horns of an angry bull." You can see here how Longfellow is very deliberate about using these poetic comparisons, right? And he's doing this in a way that's very shocking. So the first two lines of this stanza sounds very soft and innocent, fleecy waves, soft as carded wool. Think of like the children's poem about Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? That's what it kind of sounds like. And then we get these lines where it's surprising and we get the angry bull. But poetry here is being used to shock and to sensationalize. Skipping a stanza, we read, "At daybreak on the bleak sea beach, a fisherman stood aghast to see the form of a maiden fair, lashed close to a drifting mast. The salt sea was frozen on her breast, the salt tears in her eyes, and he saw her hair like the brown seaweed on the billows fall and rise. Such was the wreck of the Hesperus in the midnight and the snow. Christ save us from a death like this on the reef of Norman's woe." And I want you to also listen to the rhythm of that, right? It has this sort of nice rhythm where such was the wreck of the Hesperus. You can sing this kind of ballad, but it almost has something almost heroic to it. So what we notice in this poem is this focus on the shock factor. We see that the woman in the poem is not a real person so much. We don't know her name. She's more of a symbol. She's a stereotype. And that's one of the things that Dickinson will react to, the way in which the real lives of these people is being forgotten and it's being turned into this dramatic story. Now, we know that Longfellow was writing this poem in order to be popular with the people. And in fact, he wrote in a letter, "It will be printed in a few days, and I shall send it in some newspaper. I think I shall write more of these kinds of ballads. I have a great notion of working upon people's feelings," right? And then he's like, if I can just publish this as a broadside or broadsheet, and then with a nice picture with it, I can sell lots of copies, and this is going to be part of my success story. So we can see here how the popular genre is being used by a literary author in order to impress people and to sell copies and to be dramatic. Okay, so that's one kind of response to events in the form of a ballad. Let's look at another response to this great storm. And by the way, Dickinson is not talking about a particular storm, but she would have known about this event in 1839 that Longfellow is writing about. So there is a sort of pamphlet called Awful Calamities, and this pamphlet talks a little bit about these dramatic events of 1839. So let me read you a few passages from this pamphlet. And in one, we read about this ship, the brig Rideout, and it says, "It was driven among the dreadful breakers on the outside of Cape Cod and capsized. Every soul on board was lost. She went upon the outer breakers, and being upset, remained among them, the furious sea rolling quite over her as if she had been but a log." So what we see the writer of this particular pamphlet doing is to sometimes focus just on the actual details, how many ships were lost, how many people died, but then we also get these kinds of passages where we have this really dramatic explanation of what happened to a particular ship. And you can read the rest of the passage yourself here, but you're really going to see the drama of this. And a few details that are kind of interesting for Emily Dickinson's poem. Notice the focus on the gurgling cry of the sailors who basically can't say goodbye and they drown in a horrible manner. We also have the silence, finally, of the winds, and we're going to see that with our poem as well, this awful silence which cannot be filled with sound and things can't be explained very well. And then finally, we also have these poetic comparisons all the way through, which is the temptation for any of this kind of writing that you try to memorialize by using all of these kinds of shocking comparisons. Now, finally, this pamphlet, Awful Calamities, it also concludes with a kind of moralizing poem. And in this poem, the writer tries to give you a very nice message to kind of make sense of the tragedy. So if we just read the last stanza here, it says, "Oh, may the sons of men record the wondrous goodness of the Lord. Let them their private offerings bring, and in the church his glory sing." This is the comforting end to make sense of all this grief. Now, I've spent a lot of time on the context here before we have even gotten to the shipwreck, but I think this is critical for understanding what Emily Dickinson is doing here. So, in this poem, we have a very simple plot. There is a ship that goes down, 40 people drown, only 4 survive, and then later, those 4, or other people, the day is not very specific, but let's imagine that this is the 4 survivors, they will tell the story when winter shake the door, when it's cold outside and people want a thrilling story, they can impress people. But yet, there's this uncomfortable silence towards the end as the children want to know what happened to the 40 who drowned. And this is the question that Emily Dickinson is asking here. How do we deal with the real tragedy without writing stories that are just sensationalistic or full of moralizing platitudes? She starts with these odd words. She says, "Glee, the great storm is over." And glee means happiness, of course. People are very happy, but it's an unusual word, right? Even in the 19th century, to suddenly just say glee. The other thing that we notice here is that this sounds a little bit like a children's poem in some ways. So she starts with these different words like glee, 4, 40, like we have to define these words somehow. You can think here of how sometimes in children's poetry we have acrostics, and you get poems that kind of go like this. Like, let's say I want to describe a person named Sue. I could go, S is for sweet as a pie, U is for unnoticed as a spy, E is for erratic as a fly, and you can imagine other similar poems. In other words, we have this kind of childlike focus on single words, and with these dashes in between, we get this kind of jarring effect. So, glee, the great storm is over. 4 have recovered the land. 40 gone down together. And notice the unusual verb here as well, have recovered the land. Normally, we would say they have been recovered, or this is sort of like a passive construction. But what's happening here is that the 4 are being given agency, right? They are doing this action. They have recovered the land, which right away makes us think of, well, who is actually in control here? Is it God? Is it the ocean? Is it the people? And the unusual verb here really makes us start to think about some of these questions. Then it says 40 gone down together. And now that we think about agency, we kind of think, well, do they really have this control, these 40 people who have drowned? And the other part of this is that this sounds really pleasant, like you go down together to the pub or something like this. It doesn't quite fit the context here. And then we have this phrase, into the boiling sand. Now, we can, of course, explain this by saying that the sand on the bottom of the ocean is kind of turning over with the waves, and it looks like water bubbling up or something like that. But we should be aware that this word is unusual. It's jarring. And so right away, the poem doesn't make us feel comfortable. We are kind of disturbed by this. The next stanza goes, ring for the scant salvation, toll for the bonny souls, neighbor and friend and bridegroom spinning upon the shoals. Now the first two commands here, this is the imperative version of the verb, the imperative, it's commanding people to do actions. Ring, right, for the little salvation, you might say. And scant can be understood in two ways. So it can be understood in a sort of a positive way to say, these people barely survived, these 4 people. Or it can be understood to say, well, God didn't give much salvation here. There's scant salvation. Only 4 people survive. So what happened to the providence of God? And this word scant is used in other interesting ways in Emily Dickinson's poetry as well. So, for instance, in the poem We Cover Thee, Sweet Face, she talks about the scanty love of those people who have survived, of those people who have lost a loved one, but then maybe feel guilty about not having loved that person fully or not having expressed that love. So Dickinson is very aware of this notion that salvation and love and things like that are not always full. And this sounds like quite an indictment of God, right? Where is the full salvation? How could God only save a few people in this circumstance? The next line has this very unusual words, bonny souls. Now, again, it's kind of this childlike word. If you think of the rhyme, my bonny lies over the ocean, a folk song, which fits in nicely with the ballad genre, there's this constant focus on the beloved, the beautiful one. It keeps saying, bring back my bonny to me. And at the end of that poem, we do get the beloved coming back across the dangerous ocean. But here we have the bonny souls who are not saved. So if we think back to our word glee and this sort of childlike start to the poem, we really get this sense that all of this childlike language is not fitting very well with the actual tragedy. And we also see that in the rhythm, by the way. So if we go back to the 4th line, it says, into the boiling sand. Do you remember how we talked before about this kind of epic, heroic rhythm? Well, we have that here as well, right? Into the boiling sand. It sounds like they're doing something epic and heroic, but we know that they are drowning. Then we have this reference to the kinds of people who went down. These are our neighbors and friends, maybe even a bridegroom, somebody who's going to get married very soon. This is part of the tragedy. And they are spinning upon the shoals. So the shoals are the shallow waters or the hidden sandbanks. And the people here, just like we had the boiling sand before, here also we have the circular motion where there's no way to stop it. There's no outcome. There's no finality to this. The bodies are just spinning in the water endlessly. So very tragic. Then we get, of course, this dramatic shift in the second half. How they will tell the story when winter shake the door till the children urge, but the 40, did they come back no more? So the children are curious. How should we make sense of this? What happened to these 40? And then the final stanza, then a silence suffused the story and a softness the teller's eye. Notice the alliteration here, the S's, which create this kind of soft sound, silence, suffused, story, softness, as if now we have to have some kind of tender ending. And the question is, can we have some comfort or some tenderness towards the end of this poem? Again, Emily Dickinson surprises us with this unusual word. So the word suffuse, if you look at the etymology, which is the root of the word, etymology, this goes back to Latin, and the idea with suffuse is that we have something that is literally poured in from below, especially a liquid. So today, if we think of the word suffuse, we just use it to mean spread through something, right? A silence spreads through the story. But literally, it has this sense of liquid, which is seeping in from below. You can think of a shipwreck. So it's a really appropriate term to think about this. It's like the story is the boat which is drowning at this point, and the story can no longer survive these questions that are being asked. Okay, then we get the next line, and a softness the teller's eyes. These are tears. So if we have this idea of liquid in our mind, if softness suffuses the eye, then it's being poured in from below. So the tears are filling the teller's eye. This focus on the teller's eye should probably also remind us of a very famous poem that Emily Dickinson would have been aware of, and this is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which we have this famous opening where somebody's come back from the sea, has a dramatic story to tell, and he keeps a wedding guest who tries to go to a wedding, and he's kind of startled by this guy who wants to tell him a story. He keeps this wedding guest spellbound with his glittering eye. Okay, notice that we had this bridegroom here as well earlier, so there may be a direct influence here on Emily Dickinson. The point then is that the teller's eye is associated in this tradition, in this ballad tradition, with this notion of keeping you spellbound. But in this case, there's this failure where the teller's eye becomes soft and is filled with tears. And then we have the final two lines, and the children no further question, and only the sea reply. So here we have, again, this disjunction between the verb and the subject. Normally we would say, and only the sea replies, not reply. And we would say, and the children question no further. Well, this kind of makes sense here as question rather than questions. But it's not clear here if this is a verb or a noun. So you could say it as a verb, right? The children question no further. Or we could say, and the children, they have no further question. There is no further question to be asked here. So again, very difficult to kind of read these lines. I should say a little bit more here about this verb reply then, because on the one hand, we can say, well, the sea is the only one that is replying here. The sound of the waves, there's nothing else to be said. We don't know how to make sense of this tragedy, and Emily Dickinson refuses to write a traditional ballad, which is either sensationalistic or moralistic. She basically says, forget it, I'm not doing this. We need to think about the real impact of this tragedy. So we can understand it as referring to the sea, but because of this dash here, there is also this separation between what came first and the final verb. And I think the other way to read this is to apply it to the reader. So Emily Dickinson is saying to you, right, reply. Think of all these imperatives that we had earlier. Now the poem is turned towards you. What are you going to say? Do you have an answer to this tragedy? Right? How are you going to make sense of this? So I hope that by the end of this, you have a good understanding of this poem, which is often called the Shipwreck, but that's not its real name. And maybe the big takeaway is just the depth of this poem, how much you can read into it because of its ambiguity, but also how it makes us think about the responsibility of the poet. Should we be like Longfellow and write for a shocking effect and to print lots of poems and make lots of money? Or should we be brutally honest and admit that sometimes we are dumbfounded and we don't have all the answers?